Hello everyone, can you hear us? Williams Library, greetings.
Hello readers, William's dad joining today for a second time.
Yeah, so it's been over a month since the last time I did a live stream, but this time we're doing a special one because we have gone on a trip to Canada recently. We're still here in Montreal, Quebec, and we've been here for 2 weeks, and we've been to Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto, and Montreal again, and then we've gotten a bunch of books there because you've got a lot of used bookstores, so we've gotten a lot of books, about 25 or so, most of them in English, but a couple in French also.
Yeah, and we're doing this live from Montreal, the largest city in Quebec, the second largest in the country.
Yeah,
and it's warm today. It's been warm for many days now.
Yeah, it's about 30 degrees Celsius regularly sometimes. Yeah.
So we're doing this live from our hotel room.
Yeah. So I have about 15 books to show here in my hall, and then my father, he has about...
He has I have 9.
Yeah, so what we're gonna do is I'm gonna show a couple books, and then you're gonna show one book after each time. So the first book I got while after coming to Canada, actually, I got a couple books already on the first day we came here to Montreal. And the first book I got is a French book, actually. It's Voltaire, La Princesse de Babylone. Since I'm trilingual, I speak English, French, and Swedish, but I almost only read in English. It's like 90%. And I've read very little in French in the last few years, maybe 10 books, probably less. But I recently read a book by Voltaire a couple months ago. It was okay, so I'm giving him another chance, and I'm gonna read some of his fiction because I've seen a lot of his fiction books here in Montreal, but I'm gonna read this first before I get the whole collection of it. So that's the first book by Voltaire. Next book we've got here is The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen by Linda A. Coley. It's my father who suggested me to get this. So I'm someone who loves history, but I also love to understand the history of liberty, and this is basically a history of constitutions and looking at different ones. So I think they look at the French Constitution.
And the Japanese.
Yeah.
So they look at written constitutions and its impact on history, and including military conflicts.
Yeah.
Seems very interesting.
Yes. Now do you want to present one of your books?
So one of the books that I got is The Bomber Mafia. This is a book that came out fairly recently, but I managed to find it secondhand in perfect shape, so I'm very happy. So it's about the U.S.'s bombing in World War II and the controversy surrounding it. Because of course we know that the U.S. engaged, the Allied powers, especially the U.S. and Great Britain, engaged in strategic bombing, which was very devastating to the enemy. So this book discusses this. So it seems quite interesting. Another book that I got is on the Civil War in Bosnia, Seasons in Hell, which also I found this book also secondhand in Ottawa. And it's when I saw that Robert D. Kaplan, who I much admire, gave a positive, there was a little positive excerpt from Kaplan, I figured this book is probably interesting to read, and probably a good book to understand better the Bosnian Civil War. And another book that I found secondhand, this was in a bookshop in Ottawa, as well as these other two, The Bomber Mafia and Seasons in Hell. So Inside the Green Berets, it discusses the first 30 years. I thought this book would be interesting to read because the Green Berets are often misunderstood. They're basically seen as commandos, but they're much more than that. They engage a lot in unconventional warfare, civil society efforts, and they tend to work with on a local basis, building up institutions to better resist or rebel against a given government. So they not only engage in military matters, but also in setting up healthcare, schooling, and basically engaging in civil society actions as well as military actions. So I thought it was really interesting to better understand the Green Berets.
All right, so now I'm gonna move on to some more books of mine. So this book, The Open Societies and Its Enemies by Karl Popper. This I got very close to McGill University, which is the alma mater of my father also. And this is one of the bookstores that McGill students in Montreal go to shop at. So they had a lot of nice books there about politics and history. They're quite expensive, but they're also quite high quality. And this book, when I'm in Europe, it's usually in 2 volumes, but here I found it in 1 bound up volume, so that's good. So The Open Society and Its Enemy, this is basically a strong moral philosophical defense of liberalism, classical liberalism, liberal democracy, and it takes up all of its critics. So it looks at Plato, it looks at Marx, it looks at Hegel, it debunks them, and it also debunks historicism, and it's a philosophical defense of philosophical liberalism, you could kind of say. So yeah, it's probably a hard read since it's written by an Austrian, and Austrians write in a certain way, but should be an interesting, important read. Next book I got, which I got in Ottawa at the Book Bazaar actually, which is a very good bookstore, by the way. They've got a lot of used books there, including some turtle doves I'll show you later. But I got here the Economics of G.M. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, The Theory of a Monetary Theory by Dudley Dillard. So if you watch this channel, you may notice that I don't like Keynesian economics. I'm sympathetic to Austrian and Chicago economics. However, mainstream economics today in the West is Keynesian economics, and Keynes writes in a difficult way to understand. Bruno P. Hey guys, hey Bruno. So that's our uncle. That's my uncle Bruno, or his brother.
Yeah, hello, big brother.
Yeah, yeah. But since Keynesianism is the main form of economics, I have to give it a second chance. So this is basically an explanation of the general theory by John Maynard Keynes. So should be interesting. And also written in more legible English compared to what Keynes wrote back in the 30s. This is written in the 50s, I think, or 40s. And I also got this series of books by Heritage Love. So I got all the 6 volumes of Cross-Time Traffic by Heritage Love, which is alternate history, but it's YA alternate history. So there's a lot less violence and swearing in these books than for typical. And as you can see, they're also a lot shorter. They're about 200-300 pages. Usually Heritage Love books, they're 500 or 600 pages. And they cover a bunch of different alternate histories. So you've got here one where Rome survives, but they industrialize. You've got a book here about the German Empire winning World War I. This is a book, I think, where the Middle Ages remains, maybe because of the Black Death being a lot deadlier. Then you've got here the Disunited States of America, where the United States never becomes a full union, but you have a bunch of states instead who go to war with each other regularly. And then you have an alternate history of nuclear war. And you have a bunch of time travel in these books. And there's one more book called The Gladiator, which is about a world where the communists won instead of the free world. But however, I searched for it. It's somewhere in our bags.
Many suitcases in our bags.
But I didn't find it. I found most of them, but there's a middle volume somewhere. I don't know where it is. But that should be an interesting series to read about. So
another interesting book that I found secondhand is Wilderness of Mirrors, The Life of Gerard Bull. I've always been interested in this person because of the both Canadian and Belgian angle. So he was a Canadian scientist, extremely talented. At age 22, he was a doctor of aerophysics, the youngest doctoral graduate at the University of Toronto at the time. But it didn't end well for Mr. Gerard Bull. So he was a gifted designer of military hardware. And his career included a 2-decade-long relationship with the U.S. Department of Defense. But he then had some trouble in the US. He spent some time in an American federal prison for violating the Arms Export Control Act and the UN arms embargo against South Africa. And at the end of his career, he became involved in Iraq's Project Babylon, the so-called super gun, a gun that Saddam thought he could hit Israel with, all the way from Iraq. And this latter endeavor probably cost him his life. He was killed in Brussels. And given what he was working on and the method of his assassination, I think it's extremely unlikely that Israel's Mossad took him out. So I thought this would be especially interesting to read, given that he's Canadian and his life ended in Brussels, a city and a country where I've been living for a long time now. So I thought this would be a very interesting book to read.
This is also an example of why you never go against Israel as an individual. Because the Mossad is gonna kill you. There's an Iranian scientist who developed nukes for Iran, but he got killed a few years ago. So don't anger Israel.
Yeah, including some Germans that worked with various Arab countries after World War II. They also ended up dead.
Yeah, the Israelis hired actually a Nazi Skorzeny to kill some of them, I think. Williams Library, there was an old movie about that super gun.
Yes,
oh, yeah.
Yes, that's quite interesting, because Gerard Bull was quite gifted in designing artillery. Apparently he did pioneering work in artillery technology, and that's why he ended up having a 2-decade relationship with the US Department of Defense. But unfortunately for him, later on he went on to work for Saddam Hussein, threatening Israel, and it did not end well for him.
Now let's look at some more alternate history books. So this is actually not alternate history. This is some weird sci-fi by Harry Turlov. You can see it's a big book, and he also co-authored this. So this is Household Gods by Judith Tarr and Harry Turlov. And this is a book about a feminist in our day, or not our day. This is written in 1999, but this is a feminist in California, I think, in the 90s, who thinks she's being discriminated against living in the United States. She's a career woman, and then she suddenly gets time traveled back to Roman times, where she thinks it's a utopia and great for women. Then she realizes reality, that women aren't treated that great in the Roman Empire, and that's what the story is about. So this is not alternate history, but Harry Turlov books are almost always great, so this should be still an interesting read. And another Harry Turlov book I've got here is A Different Flesh. And this is, here you have Columbus who colonizes America, but instead of meeting Indians there, he meets they're described as primitive ape men, so something similar to Neanderthals, and you have the consequences of that. So I think I've heard something about this book, that because of these real subhumans, other races are treated quite well in this alternate universe, but these half humans, ape men, they're treated like slaves in this alternate history. Yeah.
Another interesting book that I found is Werewolf, The History of the National Socialist Guerrilla Movement, 1944 to 1946. Now, I got interested in this group because when I visited Prague a little while ago with William, we visited a Russian museum, a KGB museum run by a Russian, a very peculiar fellow, and he claimed to have items used by, I believe they were called the White Wolves, which was an underground movement trying to kill werewolves, which was a Nazi resistant movement that was put in place at the end of the war, and that continued, I believe, for a few years after World War II. And then I became interested in learning more about both the communists and the Nazi guerrillas fighting each other. And then I came across this book in Ottawa in a used bookstore. And then when I saw it's published by the University of Toronto Press, I figured it's probably a credible book. So I figured, why not buy this book and discover more about this phenomena, which is very little covered by historians, and I think the reason is that the Nazi guerrilla movement that tried to resist the Allies both towards the end of the war and after war by, for example, committing acts of sabotage, assassination, had very little impact on the course of the war and on what happened after the war. But I still thought it was interesting because it's interesting to see how non-conventional movements, by engaging in asymmetrical warfare, try to influence events. And it seems this movement went on for a few years.
There's actually an alternate history book about this movement by Harry Childrop called The Man with the Iron Heart, I think, which is where Reinhard Heydrich doesn't get assassinated and he becomes leader of this Warworth movement.
Another interesting book that I found secondhand is The Opium War. Now, I thought this was especially important to read because, well, I know quite a few Chinese, and they explained to me that still today in China, in primary and or secondary school, they still teach the Opium War and what the Japanese also did to the Chinese. And I think this in part explains the a certain level of tension and animosity that China feels towards Japan and to a lesser extent Western countries, because during the Opium War, Western countries clearly did not behave in an appropriate manner towards China, and this book discusses this. So I figured this would certainly be a book that I should read to better understand Chinese Western tensions.
Yeah, the Chinese education system, they teach something that's known as the 100 years of humiliation, which I think it's about from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, where they basically say that Western powers came in, screwed up China, the Chinese empire, and then you had the Japanese who screwed things up. And that's one of the legitimizing factors that the Communist Party in China uses, because they keep referring to this, that the West did this, so that's why we had problems in China.
So just a little excerpt from the summary on the back cover of this book. So Britain sent an expeditionary force in 1840 to compel the Chinese to accept imports of opium. This opened what was to be one of the most disgraceful chapters in the history of the empire, the British Empire. So yeah, I figured I should read this book and better understand the Chinese point of view. And another book that I found, this new, that I bought south of Montreal with my brother at Indigo, and you can get 3 books for 10 euros, and they seem to all be classics. Well, classics, or well, I wouldn't call Casino Royale a classic, but let's say
something written 50 years ago.
Right, famous books of a certain quality, literary quality. And I found this Ian Fleming novel, Casino Royale, the first one that he wrote. And I've been looking for a long time for the original novels unmodified, because William showed me a book where they changed some of the content.
Oh, yeah.
And this seems to be, I don't think this was changed. And given that this is Ian Fleming's first novel in the James Bond series, I figured it would be a very interesting book to read. And a bargain. 3 for 10 Canadian dollars, which is not very much.
Yeah, I myself got a couple of books at the Indigo bookstore, one of them in Montreal yesterday, which is here. You pay 7 Canadian dollars for one, but if you buy 3 these classics, then you get them for $10 in total. And one of the books I got here is The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And you guys know that I love Michael Crichton, and I wouldn't be surprised if The Lost World by Michael Crichton is in part lost by this, or it's a tribute to this novel. And this is a novel where they go on some sci-fi expedition, and among other things, there are dinosaurs, so that should be interesting in a novel. But there's a little disclaimer at the beginning of the book where they say this. Throughout the text, readers may find that some of the language used and sentiments expressed are unacceptable by today's standards. These reflect the attitudes and usage comments at the time of the book the time the book was written. Okay, so far so good, but you're gonna see they contradict themselves immediately, or very soon. In no way do they reflect the attitude of the publishers. In the most extreme cases, the offending words have been censored or changed, while every effort has been made to maintain the author's original intention. No, that's a contradiction. This was written in the late 19th century. In the late 19th century, almost everyone in the West was racist. So of course they used racist language when they described people. So you cannot maintain the original racist intention if you change the language and water it down. That's
yeah. I think it's terrible changing the content of classics to put them in line with today's sensitivities. Obviously, a company that publishes a classic is in no way saying that they necessarily agree with the content. It's a classic written a long time ago, and it reflects people's views at the time. And to change it to make it less potentially offensive to certain people today, I think is really ridiculous.
Yeah,
but this is we're seeing more and more of this.
Yeah, and so a lot of these famous authors, the classics, it's estates who control their work, and the grandchildren of these people often. But these children, they have some guilt about what their grandparents said or something like that, so they start screwing up their original work. Now for 1984, they're writing 1984 from a feminist perspective. So
just write a new book and say it's a new book.
Yeah, or they can say it in the universe, but
it's not the same book.
Write your own story. Yeah. And I've got another book here that I got. Also a classic, The Red Badge of Honor. The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane, which is a Civil War book. I think it's written in... Maybe this was actually written in the early 20th century, and this is written in the late 19th century. Oh yeah, another dumb thing with these books. They don't write when they were originally published, so I had to Google that, and I forgot. They only write that this edition is published in 2023. But this is a book about the American Civil War and its historical fiction, and I like reading historical fiction. I like reading fiction about the American Civil War, but I've mainly read Harry Trudelov's perspective of this, so it should be interesting to read another perspective of this, especially since this is written a very long time ago. What Harry Trudelov has written is mostly in the 90s or more recently. This is over 100 years old.
Now, the only new book that I bought this in Montreal when we had pretty much just arrived. Saving Nine by Mike Lee. Mike Lee is a Republican senator from Utah. I understand he's more of the libertarian bent. And what he means by Saving Nine is that on the U.S. Supreme Court, you have 9 justices. And Democrats have been very upset that what seemed to be, to me, a court now dominated by originalists. So basically, my understanding is there's 2 main schools of constitutional interpretation in the U.S. You have the originalist textualists, and you have the living constitution school of constitutional interpretation. And the textualists or originalists, they try to interpret the Constitution based on what the writers meant at the time, while the living constitution school, which for example is a school that Barack Obama subscribes to, says that you should interpret the Constitution based on the current times. I have a big problem with this approach because it basically means that the Constitution can be interpreted in many different ways in function of how society evolves. Well, I believe the Constitution is something that should be interpreted based on what the writers meant. And if you don't like it, if society evolves and demands, and of course it means that the Constitution should change on certain issues, then you amend the Constitution. And we've seen that in the US when there's a large majority in favor of amending the Constitution. We've seen at times the Constitution has been amended.
Yeah, we amended the Constitution to give the voting rights to women, for example. We didn't have some court to say women have the right to vote. There's a process of law.
But amending the Constitution is very difficult because it takes a qualified majority both at the national level and a large percentage of state houses need to approve, right? And that frustrates Democrats because basically they find the Constitution to be very very much hindering much of their progressive agenda. So of course they don't like the Constitution in that sense. So they would like to appoint more of the living Constitution type justices that will interpret it based on the current times. But the problem is, because of all the appointments by former President Trump, the court now has a large majority of originalists. And this is blocking a lot of the agenda of the progressives. So they've been threatening to say that we don't need to have 9 justices, we could have as many as we want, and then basically pack the court with judges that fit their agenda. And this book is about the importance of saving 9, meaning that the Supreme Court should remain at 9 justices in order to maintain what he views as the original intent of the Supreme Court and the Constitution. And because I feel that the U.S. Constitution is one of the most beautiful and important documents ever written by mankind, I feel it's important to interpret it as the writers meant and to amend it following the rules that were established. And just simply ignoring it or interpreting it based on the current times, I think is wrong, given that I think the U.S. Constitution on the whole is a very positive document, both in terms of protecting individual rights and in separating powers between different branches of government. And I think the U.S. Constitution is really key in trying to safeguard liberty in the U.S. and serve as an example worldwide. And if we just start disregarding it and interpreting it based on the so-called current times, then I think it would be a big mistake. And this book is in part about this very subject.
And anyways, the Democrats forget this, but there's the 9th Amendment, I think it is, in the Constitution, which basically says if the power is not given to the federal government in the Constitution, and if it's not prohibited to the states can do whatever they want. So apart from individual rights, the states can do pretty much whatever they want. So when you had the Supreme Court, who recently ruled on abortion, they did not say abortion is illegal now. They just said the Constitution has no opinion about this. Automatically, that means it's for the states to decide. So now you have states in the United States where in their state constitutions, it's a constitutional right to have an abortion. And then in some states, they've pretty much banned abortion. So yeah, the news may have misled you on some of this.
Right, the Supreme Court justices did not rule on whether abortion is appropriate or not. They simply said that the Constitution doesn't deal with it. And given that the Constitution doesn't deal with it, it's an issue for the states to decide on their own. Now, of course, the Constitution could be amended to make abortion a national right, or to make abortion or to forbid abortion. But then you would have to amend the Constitution, which will likely not happen, because in order to amend the Constitution, you need to have a large qualified majority. And this issue is simply America is too divided on that issue. So I don't think that would succeed. So of course that frustrates the ones that were relying on the Constitution to protect abortion rights nationally. And it's created a lot of hostility towards the Supreme Court, towards the justices that currently dominate the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I saw there was a comment here a few minutes ago. So William's Library, yeah, I told you about Julia in a comment in an earlier video. Yeah, so William's Library, he's the Indonesian YouTuber who sent me his alternate history book, which was very nice of him, and I like that book. And he made a video recently talking about how they're gonna rewrite George Orwell's 1984 from a feminist perspective, and he basically says he's gonna give this book a chance. If it expands on the universe, it's fine. And if it's a feminist propaganda, that's bad. But I'm not giving that book a chance. There's so much things to read. I'm not reading a feminist interpretation of 1984. I may reread 1984, but I'm gonna reread the classic, because that's one of my favorite books, and I'm not gonna... It's like if you have a reboot of a movie, you're not gonna watch the reboot necessarily. You're just gonna watch the original because it's good.
Well, if people want to read a feminist version of 1984, that's fine, but they should understand that they're not reading the original.
Yeah.
And my final book that I found secondhand, King Leopold's Ghost, and this discusses the very sad chapter in Belgian history when the king owned the Congo in a private manner and basically ran it in an atrocious way. And because of that, Belgium has been very much criticized for letting its king behave in such a way in the Congo. So this is really a very sad chapter of Belgian intervention in the Congo, but it should be nuanced by the fact that it was not Belgium itself, it was the king treating Congo as his own private property. When the Congo became a proper colony, then the behavior of Belgium in the Congo was, I wouldn't say it was good, but it was much less bad. It was during this period when it was the private property of the king that the behavior of Belgium in the Congo was atrocious.
Yeah, they killed 10 million people, and King Leopold, he ruled that place for 20 years, I think, from 1885 to 1905. But you need to keep in mind that at this time, or almost since their founding, Belgium has been a constitutional monarchy. So the Belgian king has had no power in Belgium itself. So although he was the dictator in the Congo, it has nothing to do with what the Belgian parliament did. Basically, King Leopold II, I think, when they had the Berlin Conference in the 1880s, he basically went to all the big powers and said, I'm going on a civilizing mission in the Congo. And they believed him, and they gave him the Congo as his personal property. And while he lived and while he controlled it, he chopped off a bunch of African arms, and also 10 million Africans got killed. So you could call him Africa's Hitler, maybe. But after a lot of international pressure, Belgium seized the colony themselves, and King Leopold was put aside.
All right,
Yeah.
but he was never punished for what he did, of course.
And if you killed,
Right, he was never punished.
No. And Belgium denied until about this book was written all of this history. They tried to whitewash the fact that you had this. They presented originally countries, they presented their imperialism as a civilizing thing, that it improved living standards, but it didn't improve living standards for the 10 million Congolese guys who died. But museums in Europe have been changing recently to provide a more nuanced image of imperialism, or now they're going the opposite direction, where they present it as a pure evil. So we've gone from imperialism being a pure good to sometimes being now a pure evil. So yeah. So next book I've got also at the book bazaar is Bring the Jubilee by Wardmore, and this is an alternate history classic. This is one of the first alternate history texts that was written. So this is written in 1955, and this is quite an optimistic vision of what if the South won the Civil War, for the American South at least. So here the American South progresses a lot, but the American North becomes basically a rump state and decays. So it's an interesting twist on the American Civil War alternate history scenario of the Southerners winning the Civil War. So yeah, should be an interesting review eventually. Next book I've got here is Superpower: 3 Choices for America's Role in the World by Ian Bremmer. So Ian Bremmer is in charge of the Eurasia Group, which is some important geopolitics firm. And this book is basically about 3 choices America has to make in the geopolitical future. So I'm not really sure what it's about, but it's about geopolitics. It's about it's written by an important geopolitics guy, so it should be an interesting read eventually. But I have a lot of I have a lot of geopolitics books, so it will take a while for me to get to it. Then I've got here my father's favorite geopolitics author here. So The Revenge of Geography by Robert Kaplan. My father has read this, what the map tells us about coming conflicts and the battle against faith. And I've read 3 Robert Kaplan books so far, but this is a classic in geopolitics, and it talks about how geopolitics and geography, it doesn't determine how the world works, but it influences it a lot. It's maybe its most important factor. And Robert Kaplan is also my favorite geopolitics writer, so it should be an interesting read. And I think I may review this in August. I may change my mind, but probably I'll review this in August.
Right, I have to say this was one of my favorite. This has been one of my favorite geopolitical books. And after reading this book, I've been searching for new books written by Robert D. Kaplan. I've read two of his other books that I've read.
Europe Shadow.
Is in Europe Shadow, and I bought recently Adriatic.
Oh, yeah.
And William read.
Oh yeah,
Monsoon.
you read Asia's Cauldron also.
And Asia's Cauldron, which I thought was even better than this book. It focuses on Asia, and I thought it was really interesting to better understand the importance of Asia and why there's so much focus on this region.
Yeah, together we own maybe a half a dozen Robert Kaplan books, and so far there's been 3 books that have been reviewed on this channel by him, and I expect to review more. So probably first this, The Revenge of Geography, and then later on we'll see. I'll be reviewing The Return to Marco Polo's World or something like that. And my father also has another couple of Robert Kaplan books, so I may review that in the future.
Yeah, what's interesting with his books is that they're not just, depending on the book, it's often also part travelogue, so he travels a lot. And he not only discusses geopolitics and military history, he also discusses literature, architecture, and how, in order to get a better understanding of the people and the tensions between various countries and how history evolves. So it's a quite educational read because it goes beyond classic history books. It discusses a lot of cultural issues in order to better understand the people, which should help you better understand the history of a given country. Sometimes it's a bit heavy because if you're not well versed in classical music, architecture, whatever, it could be difficult to read, and you could often have to consult a dictionary or simply Google in order to understand what he's referring to. But after you've gone through all that, you really get the sense that you better understand a country. And in Europe Shadow, it was focused on Romania, and after reading that book, I felt I really better understood Romania, its history, and the current situation with Romania today.
Yeah. Although depending on his book, I feel he digresses a bit too much. So when I read Monsoon, he gave a lot of imperial history, which, yeah, it can be interesting. But when I'm reading geopolitics, I don't want the first 20% of each chapter to be about a large-scale history of stuff, because it's a bit irrelevant to today, how the British, for example, colonized India 500 years ago. That's not as relevant as India today. So maybe some people enjoy reading that. It can be interesting, but it feels kind of irrelevant sometimes. And then the final book I got here, this is actually a gift I got yesterday from my uncle Bruno, who lives in Quebec. By the way,
in the province of Quebec.
Yeah.
He lives south of Montreal.
Yeah. By the way, my father, he's a pure born and bred Quebecer here, so he's half Italian and half French, but he's from Quebec, Canada. So,
right, we spoke French at home, but I largely did my schooling in English.
Yeah, and although I speak English on this channel, one of my mother tongues is French, so I communicate usually French with my father, and technically I'm a half a Quebecer in a sense, you could say. And this book is related to this. It's a Nouvelle France qu'on aurait dû vous enseigner, which by Gilles Proulx, which means New France, what you should have been taught. So I guess the author is angry that the Quebec education system doesn't teach enough about the history of Quebec.
From the French perspective.
Yeah. Because
it's important to remember that New France was vanquished by Great Britain in 1760. And of course, then you could expect that, as is often the case, I would say as is usually the case, history is written more from the perspective of the winner. So of course the history of Canada, given that Britain won and Canada became a British colony and then an independent country, but with a great deal of influence from Great Britain and much less from France, you could of course expect, you wouldn't be surprised if Canadian history is written more from the British perspective rather than from the French perspective. And this book is an attempt to have a more balanced understanding of the history of Quebec.
Yeah, so I guess this is a history basically of New France, Quebec, when it was a French colony. And historically in Quebec, you've had a lot of separatism. It has died down now, but in the 80s and 90s, I think they had two referendums. And the referendum for Quebec independence was actually much closer than the Brexit vote. So it was, I think they came at something like 49.22% was the number of people who voted in Quebec for independence. So yeah, the Quebec have a strong national identity here in Canada. They're the only province that's, or they really care about their language, their French language. And
Well, I think most people care about their language. It's just that in Quebec, many people feel that French is threatened, given that they live in an ocean of English, and most of the rest of the country is English speaking, and the U.S. is English speaking. So, given that they feel that their language is threatened, they've taken certain measures to try to protect their language. We've seen similar things with Dutch in Belgium, because Dutch was actually threatened in Belgium when the French dominated society, and they continue with measures today to try to protect their language. So we see that in a number of countries.
yeah, but the French have the Francophones in Canada have gone a bit far with their language right stuff. When we were in Ottawa and we were looking for tours of, we went on a couple of tours for the Canadian Senate and the House of Commons, and they put the number of tours 50-50. They have 50% of them are in English and 50% of them are in French, but 80% of Canada are Anglophones, first of all, so only 20.
Is it 80%, not 2/3?
No, it's 80%, but you've got
As a first language?
yeah, and half of the Quebecers speak English, so you got about 30% of Canadians, I think, who speak French, or 25%, but
But in any event, yes. So we wanted to have guided tours of the Canadian Parliament, both the lower house and the upper house. And by the way, we were very happy to learn that the guided tours were free. That's very unusual in this day and age. But we saw that it was much easier booking a guided tour in French and in English. The English ones were typically sold out or fully booked. And then I asked one of the staff members at the Canadian Parliament, why was it so easy to book a tour in French and not in English? And she explained that by law, half of the tours have to be in English and half have to be in French, which is a bit peculiar because, of course, many more foreigners will understand English than French. So foreigners typically will want to have the tour in English, and there's also many more English-speaking Canadians than French. But apparently, according to the law, half of the tours have to be in French. We thought that was an interesting bit of trivia.
Yeah, and they also, but one of the tours we went on, I think the one for the Senate, it was quite clear. It was an Anglophone from Ontario who gave the tour in French, so that's something.
Well, that was nice because typically the ones that are bilingual in Canada are French speakers that also speak English. You have many fewer English speakers or Anglophones that speak French. But this young lady was clearly an Anglophone and she spoke very good French.
Yeah,
So that was nice to see.
Yeah, it's about 50-50, I think, of people with French speakers and Anglo speakers who are bilingual. It's just that it's maybe 1 in 8 by Anglophones who speak French, but then it's half of the Francophones who speak English. Yeah. So if you comments from Williams Library. So Williams Library, Quebec is unique culturally, but geographically it's sandwiched between normal Canadian provinces. Williams Library, if Quebec was its own country, then Canada would not be continuous. Well, if one province of Canada left Canada and became independent, it's likely that Canada would split up into several different countries. So if Canada ever breaks up, it's likely that it will break up into 3 or 4 different countries, or that some of it will be absorbed into the United States. So you could have the prairie provinces in the West join the United States or be independent. The Maritimes would probably join the USA. Ontario might be its own thing. BC would be its own thing. Quebec would also be its own thing, of course. So yeah.
So it would be very complicated. As when nations break up, it usually is very complicated because there tends to be a lot of overlap. So it's not as clean as to say the French live here and the English live there. There tends to be a lot of overlap, and of course, it sometimes ends in a nightmare, as this book well discusses, because of course, even in the former Yugoslavia, and even though there's historically a lot of tensions between the Serbs, the Croats, and the Bosnians, there were a lot of intermarriages and a lot of mixing. So of course, when all of a sudden a country breaks up into various different parts, it's obviously not obvious, because there's a lot of people that have married into other groups. And then where do these people live? Do they stay in the Muslim part or go to the Croat part? Are they seen as bad by more hardliners on both sides, since they're not fully Croatian or fully Bosnian? So of course, when a country breaks up, it's often very difficult, and sometimes it leads to a great deal of bloodshed. I would certainly not expect that if Quebec separated or if Flanders left Belgium, but I would certainly expect a very complicated situation.
Yeah, and anyways, it's not in the interest of Quebec of leaving Canada, since there's a lot of wealth transfer from the English part of Canada to the French part of Canada, especially since Alberta has a lot of oil money. Some of the pensions in Quebec, they're paid by Albertans, so it's not in the interest of Quebec to leave.
Fiscally.
Yeah, in economic terms. Yeah, thanks Uncle Bruno for this book, Nouvelle France. It should be interesting to read, learn more about Canadian history from a French perspective. When I was you remember in the last book or last stream maybe, guys, that I got the history book about Canada, but that's more of an Anglo perspective. So here I have a French perspective. So it's important to read a lot of different perspectives of history to understand stuff.
Yes, I think it's really key to be a good historian, to really understand different perspectives. And it's not because you understand a perspective that you necessarily agree with it. And it seems today more and more people have trouble understanding that. But nevertheless, it's very important to understand different perspectives, even if you completely disagree with them, for example. Understanding one's view, another person's view, does not necessarily mean you accept it, but if you better understand their view, then you should be able to better understand the situation in general. And I think that's especially important for an historian.
Yeah, and it's important to be open-minded. So although I've read some books, non-fiction books written by people who really are extremely on the left, and I didn't enjoy them reading those books at all, it's important to understand their perspective and also give them a chance, because they might be right, who knows. So yeah.
And often reality is not black and white, so there's often things to gain by reading different perspectives.
Yeah, different authors focus on stuff, and people often, they're not purely bad or good necessarily. So if you read a book, for example, about Italy, fascist Italy, one book might focus on the violence that the fascists did, but then one book might also point out, hey, they saved a lot of Jews during World War II, so you can nuance stuff. It still heavily leans to one side or another if you're good or bad, but it's not black and white. Yeah.
It's often not black and white.
Yeah. So those were all the books we had to present.
Quite a few books. So I got 9 books and you got 21 books, including the one that's missing.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. The 15th one is missing. So yeah, 15 books.
And 15 including the gift. No.
Where's the...
yes. So 16.
No.
16, 17.
Yeah, 17 books.
So in total we got 26 books. So we'll be sure to put as many as possible in the carry-on luggage, which they don't weigh typically, because if it all ends up in the check-in luggage, we could quickly be overweight. So we'll be careful with that.
Yeah. Now my TBR, the books I have left to read, that list has grown a lot now. I'm well over 100 books now, just in English. So most of these books that you see, I'm not gonna read them this year, or maybe not even next year, but I hope to get to them eventually in the next 5 years or so. We'll see.
And for anyone that hasn't been to Canada, we highly encourage you to visit our great country. There's really a lot of great things to visit. We visited a very nice fortress in Chambly yesterday with my brother. and we learned a great deal about the history of not only New France, but Britain and the US and Native Americans. And we thought that was really interesting, and also was really top-notch the way they organized and preserved the fortress, and the staff very eager to answer all your questions, whether in English or French. We thought that was very nice. And also in Ottawa, we visited like I said, we had a guided tour of the House of Commons and the Senate, which was really interesting and better understanding the history of Canada. And then we also took later on a tour of the Royal Canadian Mint. And we've never seen so much gold and silver. It was very impressive.
Yeah,
and in Toronto, we visited I think one of the nicest aquariums probably in the world, the Ripley Aquarium. And then the CN Tower, and it was very interesting because high up in the CN Tower, where we had dinner, skyscrapers looked fairly small from up there, or relatively small. So we thought it was really interesting that the CN Tower is so high that even skyscrapers can look not so high. And today's our last day, unfortunately. We're leaving tomorrow to go back to Belgium. So today is our last full day in Canada. But it's been a very satisfying trip, both meeting the family, a new member of the family, and visiting a lot of great sites. And not the infrastructure, depending where you are, it's not always perfect. But this is true of many countries. But virtually everyone has been very friendly. So we've really enjoyed our trip.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed Ottawa. So it's possible that eventually I maybe do a PhD there in Ottawa or in Ontario or something like that. By the way, we were also in Canada's capital on Canada Day, which is
right, which was by chance. When I booked our hotel stays in Ottawa, I forgot about that, and then we found out it was there were Canada Day celebrations in Ottawa, and we stayed there for many hours. It was great music performances, exclusively by Canadian artists, including a live stream of a performance from Vancouver. So we thought that was really interesting because in Ottawa it was dark, and then when they live streamed the performance from Vancouver, it was quite bright. So we thought it was really interesting participating in that evening, and to be submerged in this purely Canadian music. Including many artists from Quebec. So we thought that was very nice. Everybody was friendly. There was a lot of security, but we didn't see anyone misbehaving. It was very nice. There was really a strong, you could really feel the kinship being there in those celebrations, people waving the Canadian flag, being friendly with each other. It was very easy to strike up conversations with fellow Canadians. It seems there were Canadians from across the country and including from abroad, and also a lot of tourists from abroad. So we thought it was really a nice evening. I was very happy to be able to share that with my boys.
And there were fireworks in the end. And by the way, a lot of music you hear that you think it's American.
It's actually Canadian.
Yeah, so there was
including Quebec artists who sing in English. So you might think they're Americans, but in fact they're quite often Canadians.
Yeah, so we heard a lot of good music that's sometimes on the radio, but it's Canadian music, so we got to hear that.
Yeah, so it was a very nice evening, and luckily it barely rained on us. We were very lucky because the weather was not nice at the time. Apparently my brother told me that while we were enjoying the festivities in Ottawa, it was raining in Montreal, so we were quite lucky. So that was nice.
So this was our book haul. We don't do those so often. I usually only buy a few books at a time, but this one we got 25 in total. So this is our book haul for the Canada trip. I hope you viewers enjoyed this live stream with my father.
Yeah, and hopefully some of you discovered an interesting book that you're thinking of reading. I don't know if we should say, of course we'll really know once we've read all of these books. But before reading them, which one is your favorite of all the books you've bought? Which might not be your favorite after you've read them all, but which one would you say is the one you're most looking forward to reading?
I would. It's hard to pick, so I'm gonna say.
Well, you can pick two.
No, I'm gonna pick three.
Okay.
So I'm gonna say Revenge of Geography by Robert Kaplan because he's my favorite geopolitics author, and this is a basic geopolitics book. Then there's this book I got yesterday, The Lost World, since I'm diversifying in my sci-fi reads, and I like Michael Crichton, so I want to read something that might have given him inspiration. And of course, I should pick also Harry Turlove, since he's my favorite author. I'm not sure. One of the Harry Turloves, so either Gunpowder Empire to start the Cross-Time Traffic YA series. I would say that. So, yeah, those books.
Okay, since he picked 3 books, I'll also pick 3. So
Yeah.
out of the 9 books that I bought, the 3 that I'm most looking forward to reading are Wilderness of Mirrors, The Life of Gerard Bull. Oh, sorry. Maybe let's see if I could get the 3 up there at the same time. So, Wilderness of Mirrors by The Life of Gerard Bull. Saving Mine by Senator Mike Lee. And The Opium War. So, out of the 9 books that I bought, these are the 3 that, for the moment, I'm most looking forward to reading.
All of them except one are non-fiction books. Not this, I think.
Right, the only, out of the 9 books that I bought, I tend to read much more non-fiction than fiction. The only fiction book that I bought was Casino Royale. Which is actually, right, I said that this was Saving 9 was the only new book that I bought, but also Casino Royale is one of the new books that I bought. So I bought 9 books, 2 of which are new.
Yeah. And some of the books you see here, you're gonna see reviews of them. You can expect the geopolitics and alternate history books. Maybe there will be a review of those eventually in the coming year or so. But of course, a lot of what I read, I don't review, but I read widely. So I'm looking forward to reading those books. Anyways, thanks readers for joining this live stream, or those who are watching later this live stream after it's posted. Of course, you can post questions you have in the comments below if you want to know some things about stuff. Anyways, I'm the Avid Reader. And
yes, and I'm William's dad, a big fan of the Avid Reader.
Yeah.
And I wish you guys good times until the next live stream.
we'll see you readers next time.
Goodbye.
Bye.